My name is Phillip Martin, a senior investigative reporter at WGBH and a panelist for Basic Black. And I have the privilege today to speak with Mr. Julian Bond, an icon in the civil rights movement and indeed someone who led the way for many African Americans and for Americans to try to make this land a better country than it was, certainly in 1961-62.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
It's a fact, sir. SNCC is the organization which you have found. In 2015, we're looking back at SNCC and we're looking back at other seminal events in civil rights history, such as Selma. I'm wondering, sir, if you could comment, if we could go back to 61-62, how you saw, could you possibly have conceived in 1961-62 where we are today in 2015 with the election of an African-American president?
I don't think we had any thought that a black man would be elected president of the United States. I know I certainly didn't. In fact, while Barack Obama was running for office, I thought it was a fool's errand, that it wouldn't happen, that he could not be elected. It wasn't until he won in Iowa, in this overwhelmingly white state, after he won the votes of Iowans, that I thought the possibility that he could be elected was there. And of course, it became that he was elected and he became the president. But at the time, I never thought it would happen.
And what did that portend for you when he won Iowa? Did you all of a sudden say, my God, this could happen? And what did that mean for you realistically, if you could go back to 2007?
Well, it said to me, if this overwhelmingly white state could give this man their votes, if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere in the country. And it made the possibility of it a reality for me.
Julian Bond, you yourself, of course, made history in 1965, elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. A very difficult assignment, to say the least. When you go back to that year, 1965, after seeing violence in 61, 62, 63 throughout the South as one of the leaders of SNCC, and then when you finally reached the House of Representatives and they told you you could not be seated because you had taken a stance against the Vietnam War, what was going through your head, if you can remember, at that time?
I can remember I was so irritated. I couldn't imagine that I could run for office, win that office, and they tell me I couldn't serve. I mean, just beyond belief that something like this would happen. But of course, it did happen. I had to go to court. I had to go to the Supreme Court to win my seat. But it was so irritating to think that these people thought they had the nerve to keep me out of office, and they could, at least for a time, could succeed at that.
Well, what were your concerns about the law? Because the U.S. District Court, if I remember correctly, in Georgia, or perhaps it was the Georgia Supreme Court.
No, it was the U.S. District Court said, we don't want him.
Exactly.
You know, we'll throw him out, and they kept me out. But then I appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court voted in my favor, and I won that election, and there I am.
And of course, you were out for almost an entire year, though, correct?
Indeed, so almost a year.
And when you think back to that period, and then you think back, you think to the point where we are now, not just with the election of a black president, but with politics the way they are in the country, how have things stayed the same and how have things changed?
Well, they're sort of the same and different at the same time. The politics of the country are a little different. The numbers of black people holding public office, the numbers have gone up a bit. The numbers of black people running for public office have gone up a bit, but still it's difficult for black people to run for public office in America now and get elected. They happen here, they happen there, they happen over here, but nowhere near you think they ought to or would be reasonable in any reasonable condition. So things are the same and different at the same time.
And those politics, of course, are not monolithic. You have two senators right now, an African-American senator who is, of course, from South Carolina, who happens to be a Republican. And, of course, we've had a history of, short history, of African-American senators as well. What do you think about those African-Americans who profess loyalty to the Republican Party, a party you once described in talking about one aspect of that party as you talked about the Taliban wing of the Republican Party when George Bush was elected and brought on Ashcroft, for example, as the Attorney General. What is your view about individuals who have basically aligned themselves with Republican politics, something which many is anathema to many African Americans because of its the conservatism inherent in those politics?
It was and is an anathema to me, and I can't understand why people do it. You know, if you decide you want to be a Democrat, if you decide you want to be a Republican, that's okay to me. Choose as you wish to any political party you want. That's okay. But the way some of these people behave is just beyond my thought. Now, the South Carolina senator I met as he was running for office the first time, I met him in Charleston. I was walking down the street in Charleston. I ran into him. He introduced himself to me, told me he was running for the U.S. Senate. I said, good luck to you. I didn't think he could win either. But of course, in South Carolina, to my great surprise, he was elected, and now he serves. Good for him. But not somebody I would want to have serve in the legislature that I was a member of.
Let's talk about Georgia for just a second. And Georgia, of course, has changed a lot. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it has been unable, it seems politically, to get beyond a certain frame of politics. It still seems to be a largely red state or a conservative state, despite the large numbers of African Americans there, and despite the political legacy of individuals such as yourself. How might Georgia, or when do you see, if in fact you see Georgia changing to something we might call progressive or more liberal, if you will?
Georgia will change, and in the last election, it was on its way to changing. There was a massive voter registration drive conducted across the state in Georgia. The numbers of black voters went up, and concurrently, the number of white voters went down. But the possibility existed that this number of black voters would overwhelm the number of white voters. As it turned out, it didn't happen. The effort was great, but wasn't great enough. There's not enough work done. More work will have to be done in the future. But the possibility existed, and observers said this could happen here in Georgia. Georgia will be a purple state, if not a blue state, but it was not to be.
If you will, I'd like to go back to a seminal documentary series in which your voice, you are the narrator. Your voice is ubiquitous. Everyone knew and knows Julian Bond's voice in Eyes on the Prize, a Pulitzer Prize winning and as well as an Oscar winning documentary series, parts 1 and 2. In addition to being the narrator, you were one of the many movement leaders featured in the seminal documentary. I'm wondering, how did that series change the way the story of the civil rights movement has been told?
You know, actually, I only played a small part in the documentary because Henry Hampton, who was the genius who put this all together, told me I could either be in one part of the documentary or none of it. And if I was in none of it, I'd have to be the narrator. And the narrator should not be seen, should just be heard. So I said, okay, I'd rather be in every series and not be heard, and not be seen. So I took myself out of the documentary. The only place I appeared in the documentary was a scene where I'm refereeing a fight between Maynard Jackson, the mayor of Atlanta, and Muhammad Ali. And in this fight, Maynard Jackson knocks out Muhammad Ali, and I count him out. I give him the long count: 1, 2, 3. And you see Ali lying on his back like this. So that's the one point I appear in Eyes on the Prize. But it's just a wonderful thing. It is the best thing done, not because I'm the narrator, but the best thing done on television about the civil rights movement. And anybody who wants to learn about the civil rights movement could do well to go to the library, go to someplace and rent this and look at it, because it's the best thing going.
I wonder, in the Eyes on the Prize, of course, one aspect of it is about the Freedom Riders. Those young people organized by SNCC to basically tried to make their way to New Orleans before, of course, they ended up in a jail in Alabama. And one of the great experiences of my life was traveling with student recreators, student freedom riders in 2011. I traveled with them into Alabama and Mississippi, right. And we have headed up to Tennessee, of course, to Nashville, where many of you folks the SNCC was organizing, and those students were absolutely blown away by the by the experience and by history. If there was anything you would do differently in that incredible ride into the South, the Freedom Riders into the South, which ended in bloodshed and violence, and the bloodshed and violence, of course, was on the onus was on those who participated in that, who perpetuated that. And I'm wondering, is there anything you would do differently?
Probably not. The recreators, I think, didn't face this violence, didn't face this blood.
That's right.
It's the originators who did. And they proved to be brave, courageous people carrying on a wonderful, wonderful crusade, demonstrating a level of bravery that I could not undertake myself and was not willing to undertake myself. So they just said to the rest of the country, you can win these fights if you're willing to fight and sacrifice something. If you're willing to get rid of some of your blood, you can win these fights, and they've won these fights.
Here, another question: How did you think the second part of Eyes on the Prize, that which focused on school desegregation through busing in Boston, how do you think that? What is it about Boston and white resistance that even today makes people of color of a certain age wary of coming to this area?
I hate to say it, I'm a little wary of Boston today. I've been afraid to. I'm married to a woman who's a tremendous sports fan, and she wants to go to a baseball game. And I said, no, I don't want to go. Don't want to go to this park. I don't want to go to a game there. I don't want to sit in place. And it turned out in this particular case, I went with her. And the people in front of us are telling us jokes about how they turned out to be college students looking for recruits to their college. And they said they made sure they never told any black people about their college. They didn't want that to happen. And just reinforced my feelings about Boston, which probably are not exactly true. Probably the place is not as bad as I think it is, but this cemented it to me.
If you could say anything to the mayor of Boston, who realizes that this is a problem, Marty Walsh, and he's addressed it, and Boston has just been issued a $1 million grant to engage communities around race with busing as the backdrop. If you could say one thing to Mayor Marty Walsh about how you might change the perception of Boston, what might that be?
I think he's got to find some way, and I don't know how he could do it, he's got to find some way to engage white Bostonians and tell them that they've got to behave better, they've got to change their way of acting, and become more interested in being decent to other people, to people not like them, to people who are not people of color. They've got to find some way to embrace them, and how or if they can do it, I really don't know, but that's at least a beginning for them.
In Eyes on the Prize, this particular segment that I'm speaking of about Boston and busing, several scenes were shown of extraordinary violence directed against black students and of white parents who wanted to send their kids to these schools in spite of what was happening. They basically went against the boycott, and they, of course, were penalized for it. They were basically it was determined by some that they had sold out. And I'm wondering if you could talk to these parents. Here's another question: if you could talk to those parents today, what might you say to them about how things have changed, in your view?
I don't know Boston that well. I'm seldom here. I don't go into any neighborhoods. I'm probably not the best person to ask this question or to answer this question. But if you're willing to risk, if you're willing to take a chance, then go ahead. You ought to do it. If you can go into these neighborhoods where others have gone before you and risk before you, good for you.
I'm going to take it out of Boston for a second and head to Washington, D.C. Why do you think this president has faced so much animus from the Republican Congress, including the current Congress? You at one point used the term, as I mentioned earlier, the Taliban wing of the Republican Party. Some have argued that the Republican Party has grown even more conservative and used Ted Cruz as an example and Rand Paul as an example. What is it about this president that has, if you will, engendered such animosity?
He is a black man. That's the reason he's gendered so so much animus. That's the reason people don't like him, because he's black. We're a black man. That's the only reason they're against him. Not against him because he's a Democrat. They're not against him because he believes in this, that, or the other thing. They're against him because he's a black man, and black men ought not be president of the United States in their view.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. What makes you think, or why do you say he's viewed the way he is as a result of the color of his skin?
I know that's the case. I know that's the case. I can't prove it. I can't say here's the reason why. This is my proof, but I know it to be true. I know it to be true.
You're speaking from experience.
From experience, yes.
And have you in meeting with? No doubt you've met with the president. I'm just wondering, has he ever expressed concerns about this central issue in the United States we call race?
Not to me. We've met a couple of times together about this or that or the other thing. I've tried to be encouraging to him because any president needs all the encouragement he can get. I don't care who he is, but I haven't had a racial discussion with him.
Selma, it has become a metaphor as much as it is, of course, a historical event. What did you think of the movie?
Well, I tell you, people in the civil rights movement, like myself, don't like any movie about the civil rights movement. I don't care who it is, who made the movie, who's in the movie, whoever it is, we don't like it because it almost always fails to reveal the truth of what we know to be. So you see this movie, and I urge people to go see the movie, even though there are things in the movie I don't like. I urge people to go see it. There are things in there I don't like, and I know not to be so. I'm upset, for example, of the treatment of President Johnson. Now, if you follow politics and you know anything about President Johnson, there have got to be things you don't like. But one of the things you cannot dislike is Johnson's attitude toward voting rights. He is the best civil rights president we have ever had in this country. There's nobody better than Lyndon Johnson. And to say in this movie that he played a bad role in the struggle for voting rights is just a terrible, terrible mistake. This disputes the kind of decent man he was on this regard, and this regard only. He was a wonderful guy, and to call him a bad guy on this is just stupid. It's ignorant. But nonetheless, that's what the movie says.
It's a key point, of course, because it was a point of contention throughout.
Let me tell you something. You look at the movie, and you see President Johnson and Martin Luther King together, and they're disagreeing. President Johnson thinks this, Martin Luther King thinks that. The next thing you see is President Johnson saying, "Get me J. Edgar Hoover." J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. And J. Edgar Hoover, next thing you see is Martin Luther King and his wife listening to a sex tape that Martin Luther King has received in the mail. And you get the idea that J. Edgar Hoover has sent this and sent it to Martin Luther King and made him nervous about his situation in life. Of course, that's not true. Robert Kennedy did this, not not the president, not Lyndon Johnson. So it's a mislabeling of events. It's untrue. It makes Lyndon Johnson the bad guy in a situation where he's not the bad guy at all. But there it is.
You're saying the Attorney General Robert Kennedy did this
yes,
at
he
the
did.
time.
Right. And he was FBI. He was head of the Attorney General before Lyndon Johnson was president.
So the critics of the movie are essentially correct, is what you're saying.
On this matter, yes. There are other things, parts of the movie that are okay, and I would say go see them and learn something about American history.
Now, what about the march itself? The out of the context of the movie, the march this past year, just a month ago, in fact, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that was. In which the president took part in, as well as Michelle Obama and their children. How did that make you feel when you saw that?
I'm happy to see that. I'm proud to see this black president marching across the bridge. It's a wonderful occasion. But I tell you what's a little upsetting. It's the number of members of Congress who go as if they can be washed clean because they've marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And now the governor of Missouri, not Missouri, what is it? What state is it?
Of Alabama.
No, not of Alabama. Of the state that's under attack now because of
Indiana.
Indiana. The governor of Indiana is saying, "I've been washed clean by this. I went with John Lewis across the bridge, and now I'm okay. As if he's saying, I used to be a bad guy, but now I'm a good guy because I marched across the bridge with John Lewis. Come on, give me a break.
In other words, this was a form of exculpation.
Yes, exactly so, exactly so.
And
you say it better than I could.
I think you said it very well. The Selma, though, is in that sense, but there've been a lot of episodes like that, have there not been? Where, in fact, you have sites throughout the South now that are being essentially turned into tourist sites, where
yes, and I take groups through these sites every year. I take for the last 8 years. I've led civil rights tours and taken people to these places and showed them where these things happen. I think it's wonderful that people want to see them. People want to learn about where the movement was made and who made it. So it's fine with me.
But there are individuals within these states who essentially say, well, things have changed. But the question many have they changed because of economic expediency, or have they changed because some of these individuals really have changed because of the, if you will, the exigency of law?
I think they've changed because some people have said, if I go to these places, I can wash my hands of the evil I may have done in the past, just by showing up at these places. Of course, that's not true. If you go to these places because you want to see the history, you want to see what happened there, good for you. Good of being able to learn these things. But if you're going just to say, I'm okay because I've been to Selma, that's not true.
Sort of historic catharsis.
Yes, right, exactly so.
This question, sir. You've been hearing the term, and there have been many. One is Black Lives Matter. It's become a slogan. It's become a hashtag on Twitter. It's also, some say, it's become a movement. But has it? And I ask that because many of the current social justice movements are a direct result of the deaths of African American men, and at the hands of local law enforcement. Groups have been created and formed around this one issue, which has a larger context, of course, of segregated neighborhoods, joblessness, high unemployment, low rates of graduation. And the question I have is this: how do you turn a moment? How do you turn a moment into a movement?
Well, I think you do it by having some aim at the end of your march. If you're just marching to march, good for you, but I don't think there's much to it. What I find wanting in these many protests that arise from the murders of black men by policemen, and these are murders of black men by policemen, what's lacking there is some end goal. What's the outcome you want to have this? Do you want some change in the police department? What ought that change be? How should policemen behave here? How can they behave differently than they're behaving right now? And unless that's part of your protest, I don't think you're accomplishing much.
And would you say this is across many protest movements at the moment? And I ask that question in the context of not just Black Lives Matter, which has spurred demonstrations around the country, but also that which preceded it, which was the Occupy movement. What are when you looked at these movements, out of which came at least a discussion on income inequality, and with Black Lives Matter, a discussion about police violence, is there something else that has to take place?
Yes, there is. The Occupy movement was good, but it wasn't as good as it should be, in my view. And the Black Lives Matter is good, but again, it's not as good as it should be. What's the outcome here? What do you want to happen? What's the end game? I have yet to find out.
When you look at black journalism today, that's a question about my own profession. And let me just rephrase that. When you look at journalism today, and among many journalists, of course, are a larger number of African Americans than there were certainly in the 1960s and 70s. What do you see as a responsibility of black journalists, and are they living up to that in the context of if you will, our standard assumption of thinking in this country?
Some are, I think, and some probably are not. I don't know all of them. I don't follow all of them as I might, or as I maybe used to. When I was younger, and read black journalists more often than I do now, read black newspapers more often than I do now, I could give you a better answer for this, but right now I don't think I'm up to date as I ought to be with black journalists.
That suggests that something's being lost in the...
It is, absolutely. I don't read black newspapers as much as I used to, and therefore I'm lacking.
And do you think and certainly, do you think that that is something that is problematic in terms of African American communities around the country?
Absolutely, absolutely. We don't read these papers as we used to, as we ought to. We don't support them. We don't help them exist. We don't make them as necessary as we used to make them in our lives.
Is there I'm counting down to the final questions because I realized that I'm probably, I may have gone over my time. All right, all right, thank you. I find it absolutely remarkable that when you think about the type of changes that are taking place in the country, are there structural changes that you would, in fact, applaud, or are we seeing a sort of gradual changes that really might not amount to what you might call watershed changes or watershed movement in this country? In other words, we've seen some African Americans, Latinos, poor whites ascend into the middle class. But at the same time, the middle class is sort of under assault, many feel, as a result of the vicissitudes of the economy, 2008. Are we making changes that what you would call fundamental change in sort of the seismic type changes that occurred during the civil rights movement?
No, I wouldn't. And as you would say, it's the vicissitudes of the economy. It's nothing we've done. It's probably a lot of things we didn't do or we haven't done. But the country is facing these awful shifts in the economy, and we've not found a way to deal with them.
And many black people who found themselves or saw themselves in the middle class, who owned homes, perhaps briefly, in the 2000s, who lost those homes in 2008. What is happening to the black middle class in your view?
They're just shaking it as best they can, trying to get it from day to day to day to day. They're losing their spot in the economy, and they don't know how to regain it.
Julian Bond, talk about the role of unions in that context.
It's tremendously important. Unions are such an important part of what the economy ought to be, but unions are under attack. They're under assault by all kinds of moneyed interests. It's difficult to understand how this is happening, but unions are disappearing, and to our universal sorrow. If you are a working person and you don't have the effect of a union to protect you, you're in bad shape.
I'm just going to ask you just a few other questions, a few personal questions. At one point, you were considered a vice presidential candidate in the 1980s. You would have been the youngest person selected as a vice presidential candidate, if I'm remembering correctly. Any regrets about that not happening?
No. It wasn't. It didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen, and I don't like to say this went wrong. I like to go forward and say, let's make this go right.
And in terms of where we are now, again in 2015, and with the possibility of a woman being elected president, in this case, of course, Hillary Clinton, who, of course, will have to get past a steep group of Republican contenders, including Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida. How do you see her chances, and would you support Hillary Clinton for president in 2016?
Well, we don't know who else is going to run, so I don't want to say right now.
Martin Mallory, for example.
I think she's a good candidate. She will be a good candidate. But I had someone tell me the other day that it would be easy for America to elect the first black president. It'll be hard for America to elect the first woman. And I was struck. I never had anybody put it to me in that way. And if that's true, I think that says something awful about our country.
And what does it say about our country?
It says that we'll reject a woman candidate, no matter whom she may be, no matter who she may be, no matter what her candidacy is about, no matter what her qualifications is, and that speaks poorly of us.
One of the candidates, one of the names, not a candidate, let me rephrase that. One of the names that continues to come up in the context of the 2016 presidential election Democratic nominee or nomination is that of Elizabeth Warren. What's your view about Elizabeth Warren and her embrace of her fight against income inequality?
I take her at her word that she's not going to run, and she's not going to run, so I can't consider her as a candidate.
But how do you consider her in general?
I think she's a wonderful person. She's been a great senator. She's much good about her. She's a wonderful person. But again, she's not running. And every time somebody asks her, she says no.
And just a final question. In terms of your presence here at Brandeis University, receiving this prestigious honor, and certainly Brandeis is lucky and happy to see this happen, and I think the region is happy and lucky to see this happen. Did you ever think that you'd be back here in this capacity, considering like the violence that you watched on the cutting room floor and that you watched in The Shape of Eyes on the Prize when the series first aired, and given the violent history of this city and your own concerns about what Boston was at that time?
No, I never considered this would happen to me. I'm flattered that Brandeis has chosen to give me this award. It's flattering. I'm happy to see it, but I never thought it would happen.
And I think that you are well deserving, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it.